On Sunday, Shane Norcross, our group's director, and I kicked off a series of conversations around a really important topic of fresh starts. And during that conversation, we were looking at the letter of Genesis, and Shane asked me a question. He said, "Hey, Buck, what about people who have doubts or think that the letter of Genesis is like myth or allegory or made up?" And I responded to him. I said, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair pushback. And the reason why I think that's fair is because when you look at the letter Genesis and you look at the creation account, is it 6 literal days? Because that doesn't match up with science, which would create doubt. When you look at Adam and Eve and you read their story and how their lifespans and a lot of details, you're like, that kind of sounds like fairy tale. And then when you broaden that a little bit and you look at, not only Genesis, but Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which are the first 5 letters of the Bible, which, by the way, side note, those are called the Pentateuch. And the Pentateuch is a Greek word that simply means 5 letters or 5 books. Or if you're Jewish, you would just call that the Torah. So all the same thing. But when you broaden it and you look at Genesis and the Pentateuch, then you see some of these linguistic, inconsistencies. You see that there's multiple names for God, which are like, is it one God or multiple gods? And then there's even a theory developed as a result of that called the JEDP theory, which is kind of hard to say. Say that like 5 times, you're like, what? But the JEDP theory is all around the idea that there's not one author, which tradition would say the one author is Moses, but there's actually multiple authors of the Pentateuch. So we could keep going and going, but my point is this, is that if you have doubts or if you're thinking like the letter of Genesis, I'm not so sure about that, or maybe it's made up, completely fair. But here's what I would ask you to at least consider. Guys, when it comes to the Pentateuch, when it comes to Genesis, there are really good answers to the questions that you're asking. And they may not be emotionally satisfying answers, but they are certainly logically satisfying answers. For example, when it comes to creation account, you look at the original, language, which was Hebrew. It was written in Hebrew. And you look at the Genesis chapter 1, and when it talks about days, it uses the Hebrew word yom, which can mean a short period of time, or it can mean a long period of time, which that context really fits well with science. Or then when you think about the names of God, like why is there multiple names of God? Elohim and Yahweh and Jehovah, what does all this mean? Or Adonai? That's not multiple gods. It's just describing God. Let me give you an example. In Genesis chapter 1, it's the Hebrew word Elohim is used to describe God. Well, Elohim means God is creator. And then in Genesis chapter 2, you see the name Yahweh, which Yahweh is like the big title for God, which is like very personal. This is who God is, which fits the context because in Genesis 2, he creates Adam and Eve. And just like if you were describing me or writing a story about me, you would say, hey, Buck's, a father, Buck's a pastor, Buck's a husband, Buck's a friend, all those kind of things. I'm still Buck, and the same is true with God. He's still God. It's just descriptions that fit the narrative or context. So there's really good answers to a lot of the questions that you're asking, and I would strongly encourage you to check those out. The second thing I would talk about, which I love, I think this stuff is so fascinating, is the whole archaeological world. There's a couple things in the letter of Genesis specifically that for years and years and years, for centuries, people would say didn't exist. For example, the city of Ur. This is in Genesis chapter 11. Abraham's from the city of Ur. People would say, hey, the reason you can't trust Genesis is because there's no evidence of the city of Ur. Well, in the last 100 years, we've discovered the city of Ur from an archaeological perspective. And it's a fascinating city. More and more discoveries around this city. There was massive trade. It was awesome. It existed just as Genesis said. Another example of this is the Hittites. For years and years and years, people would say, hey, you can't trust the letter of Genesis because the Hittites. Well, in the last 100 years, we've discovered the Hittites actually existed because of what we've discovered in the whole archaeological world. And guys, I'm telling you, that's a whole fascinating world, especially in the last 15 to 20 years. And I would really strongly suggest exploring that. But I think perhaps the greatest answer to this, and I shared this on Sunday, is really it has to do with the person of Jesus Christ. And the reason why we can trust Genesis and the Pentateuch and really the Old Testament is because of what Jesus said. And here's the deal. I don't think we'll ever know for sure about, the patriarchs and Abraham and Isaac and all that kind of stuff because we weren't there. And there was no video cameras and all that kind of stuff. But here's the deal. Jesus Christ, we do have evidence of. In fact, I don't think there's any honest historian, either is a Christian or not a Christian, who would disagree with the fact that Jesus is a historical person. And we have historical letters that we have today from Jesus' time. And Jesus, in his teachings, talked about, from an authoritative perspective, that Genesis is the real deal, that Adam and Eve are real people. And he talked about each one of the letters that we would see in the Pentateuch or the Torah. And if Jesus really is the Son of the living God, if that's what we've concluded, and we trust him with our eternity, we trust him with our life, then we can also trust him with the letter of Genesis. Thanks so much for tuning in. Hey, I will see you this upcoming Sunday as we continue this conversation around experiencing a genuine fresh start.